For the last few weeks up here where I live, I've been watching birds who are building nests in the eaves of my home. And I've been watching wild turkeys doing their mating dances. And I'm watching the wildflowers in the forest just spring to life. And it reminds me of what I would describe as life's love affair with life. And so when I think of life, I think of all of the stages of life, beginning, middle, and end. And as you know, for each month I take a theme, I develop it in the first 2 Sundays, and then the third Sunday I do a recap, and open up to a Q&A. And so for the month of April, I've chosen to deal with the issue of abortion. And I actually wrote a full chapter in one of my books in 2006, a book called Souls and Safari. And I titled the chapter, To Be or Not to Be, Some Ideas on the Topic of Abortion. So the reading I've chosen today is actually from a good friend of ours, a companion who lives down in Tasmania, Amy Dillon. And she wrote this to me a few weeks ago when I told her of the topic I was going to be addressing in April. So this was Amy's hit on it. I often wonder if we had a society that elevated motherhood to legendary status and celebrated the roles of mothers as intrinsic to the healing of humankind, and saw all children as the precious vessels of wisdom for our future that they are, we wouldn't be having this discussion. Society has sold us a lie, that life is expendable, kids are dumb and annoying, and convenience is king. These are words inspired by God. So to introduce this topic, I want to use a metaphor. So I want you to imagine that there are 4 different people, each of them building their future home. So John clears the site where he's going to build the house. And then before he can get started, people start using the site as a garbage dump. And so he can't build his home. Judy manages to dig her foundations and pour the footings, but somebody comes along in the middle of the night with a backhoe and destroys the whole thing. So she can't live in her home. James gets as far as framing and roofing his house, and then somebody comes and burns it down. So he can't live in his home. And finally, Jennifer completes the building, moves in, and is asleep when somebody bombs it and kills her, and she can't have a home. Now, the result is exactly the same. Each person is denied a home, but the damage is radically different depending on the stage of the house building. And I believe that that's very important when we talk about the topic of abortion. In any abortion, a soul is denied a home, but the suffering of the spacesuit becomes increasingly more brutal depending on how far along the pregnancy has developed. So I'm going to talk first then about debate, discussion, and dialogue. And this is true about any topic whatsoever. I believe that there are always 2 poles to a communication. So there's a statement that says, the wise man can learn from the fool, but the fool can't learn from the wise man, because the wise man realizes that everybody can teach him something, and the fool believes nobody can teach him anything. So as a psychologist, I've seen when I do couples counseling that there are 2 great poles to a discussion or a debate of any kind. And it doesn't matter what the topic is. So the first pole is this. On any topic, if there are intelligent, moral, and spiritual people on opposite sides of a debate, then there must be some merit to both positions. So I would regard that as the first pole of any discussion or dialogue. If there are intelligent, moral, and spiritual people at both sides or opposite sides of any debate, then there must be some merit to both positions. That's the first pole. The second pole is that not all viewpoints are equally valid. So for instance, Hitler's viewpoint on the Jews and Elie Wiesel's kind of viewpoint on the Jews, are not equally valid. Nor is kind of the view of the Ku Klux Klan, and Martin Luther King Jr. equal when it comes to people of color. And so not all viewpoints are equally valid. And so any discussion must proceed with these 2 realizations. If there are intelligent, moral people on both sides, there's some merit to both sides. But all viewpoints are not equally valid. To make a claim, in fact, that all viewpoints are equally valid is, in philosophical terminology, we would call it a performative contradiction and a logical fallacy. If I make the claim that all positions are equally valid, then I'm elevating that claim to being the best. And so I've actually contradicted myself. So to make the claim that all positions are equally valid means that I'm elevating that claim of mine, that all positions are equally valid, I'm elevating that to the top position. So obviously all claims can't be equally valid. So speaking philosophically, it is a performative contradiction and it is a logical fallacy. Now, all moral choices must dance between these two poles. So no matter what the topic is, we have to dance between these two poles. And that's what I'm going to try to do for the next 2 weeks. I realize that there are dedicated, moral, intelligent people on both sides of this discussion. And I also realize that all positions are not equally valid. So how do we arrive at a position where we listen to each other and at the same time establish what the priorities are? So for the first session today, I'll develop it next week, God willing. I want to talk about the movement from life to human life to personhood to en-soulment. They're the kind of the 4 first stages when we begin to examine this topic. We have to understand, what does life mean? And then what does human life mean? And then what does it mean to be a person? And then what does it mean to be an ensouled person? A person that's animated by a bite-sized piece of God. So in order to understand life, then I'm going to dig into that and then look at human life and then personhood. If we don't understand that, we have to understand what life is, what human life is, what personhood is, then the abortion debate is just mired in emotional dueling. And I certainly don't want to get into that. I want to see if we can build a case to establish what is the most moral thing to do in particular circumstances. And circumstances will change decision making. I'll talk about that more next week, God willing. So when does life begin? When we talk about life, when does life begin? According to Roman Catholic teaching, it begins at conception. That the moment that a sperm meets an egg and a zygote is established, God creates a brand new soul and infuses it into the zygote. That's the current Roman Catholic version. It wasn't always like that. Thomas Aquinas, probably the greatest Catholic theologian of all time, who lived between 1225 and 1274, believed that it took 40 days for a soul to inhabit a fetus if the fetus were a boy, but it took 80 days for the soul to inhabit a fetus if the fetus was a girl. Now, where the hell did they come up with this thinking? That was the medicine of the day. When they did post-mortem examinations on pregnant women, that was the conclusions to which they came. After 40 days, you had a boy, and after 80 days, you had a girl. So the idea that, life begins at conception wasn't true in the Catholic Church for a long period of time. So if it doesn't begin, if it begins at conception, that's one notion. What if, life only begins at what's called the quickening, when the mother for the first time feels movement inside in her womb? Is that the beginning of life? Some people would claim that's when life begins. Other people would say that the detectable heartbeat, there's a detectable heartbeat after 6 weeks of gestation. So some people would say that's when life begins, when you can detect an actual heartbeat inside the womb. Another position is it depends on the viability of the fetus. That is not really a life form unless somehow it can sustain itself. Now, we're beginning to see with current medical technologies that viability is shrinking. It's going back earlier and earlier into a pregnancy. There was a time when if you were born prematurely, it was a death sentence almost immediately. And so now we know that babies have survived 3 or even 4 months being born prematurely. So is viability the argument for the beginning of life? And other people would claim that life does not begin until the child takes the first breath. So the child comes out, you cut the umbilical cord, slap it on the backside, turn it upside down, and it takes its first breath. And then that's the beginning of life. Now, life is more complex than that, I believe. I always remember there was a restaurant near my office in Los Altos, and I would go there at lunchtime every day. And I remember one day I was eating a bowl of vegetable soup. Imagine me eating vegetable soup. And I fish out a piece of broccoli. And as broccoli is on my spoon, and before I put it in my mouth, I begin to think, even this little piece of broccoli, it has 3 different kinds of intelligence. The first part I would call creative intelligence. because at some stage there wasn't broccoli on the planet. So there was a first session, a first version of it that set up some kind of a morphogenetic field, allowing other broccolis to develop as well. So they had to create a morphogenetic field and then a prototype of what broccoli would look like. So I'm looking at this piece of broccoli, realizing that extraordinary creative intelligence that allowed it to come into being in the first place. And then I'm looking and I'm seeing that there's a second kind of intelligence that I would call sustaining intelligence. That this particular piece of broccoli in the ground, it was depending on photosynthesis. It was, photosynthetically taking energy from the sun in order to build its own body. And it was taking minerals from the soil and water from rain. And so it had this extraordinary ability to sustain itself. And then the third one I would call regifting intelligence, that when this piece of broccoli was cut and now I'm eating it, it's becoming part of me. So in some senses, it's gifting me. So it's giving back to the ecosystem. And when I think about this, actually, it reminds me of the Hindu notion of Trinity, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. Brahma is the creative force, Vishnu is the sustaining force, and Shiva is the regifting or the destructive, only in the sense that it reconfigures the elements in order to create a higher life form. So I'm looking at this piece of broccoli, realizing the extraordinary intelligent resident in just this tiny little piece of vegetables. So when I think about life, that's what comes up for me. Wherever I can see those three elements, creativity, sustainability, and regifting, I know I'm in the presence of life. So that's the first thing. So I have to establish what life means to me. So then the next step is to figure out what is the difference between life and human life. Is there an important distinction? So at some stage when life is kind of the native intelligence of an organism, now what does that mean when the organism is a human being? Because a rose, an elephant, and a concertplanus, they're all alive. The question is, which of them is a human being? So when then does life become human life? At what stage, is the zygote or the embryo or the fetus a human being? So we have to look at the trajectory. At what stage does it become not just a life form, but a human life form? Now, in answer to this question, I don't think science can give us the answer. And I don't think that the legal system can give us the answer. The answer to this question, when does a life become a human life, I think is a spiritual and perhaps even a mystical question. So looking to science or looking to the law to determine when a life becomes a human life, I don't think that's the place to look. I think we have to look at a much, much higher level than that. So if we're looking at that, then the question becomes, when is abortion the taking of a human life? And is there a stage at where abortion is not taking a human life, is taking a life, but not a human life? So these are the kind of questions we have to wrestle with at a spiritual level. So obviously, there's a huge difference between a 2-day-old zygote and an 8-month-old fetus. And so, for instance, if we're talking about some forms of abortion, obviously, there's a huge difference between a morning after pill that just vacates a zygote, whose size is less than the period at the end of a sentence, on the one hand, and an 8-month-old fetus who's pulled literally piece by piece out of the womb. So there's a huge difference between them. So when you're talking about human life, then these are the kind of considerations. And when you think about viability, at what stage is the embryo or the fetus viable? How long could it sustain itself given the proper environment? So when you think about it, even a 2-year-old child is utterly incapable of sourcing its own food, its own shelter, its own clothing, and its own emotional support. And so it's not viable. For the first 2 years, a child is not viable. It can't find any of its own resources. So why not allow a mother or a jealous sibling to kill it? What's the difference then between late-term abortion, and killing a 2-year-old if the argument is about viability? So that's the second level then. Once we've established, life and human life, to whom then do we accord personhood? Because personhood is actually different from human life, historically, very, very different. So I'm moving now from the notion of life per se to human life to personhood. Who decides who is a person? So what kind of a decision is this? Affording personhood to a human entity. Whose decision is it? Is it the lawmakers? So is it a legal enactment? Is it to the medical community? So is it a biological consideration? Is it a religious consideration? So is it a theological issue? Or is it completely a private matter that the mother decides whether or not the unborn is a human person and a accorded person? Now, when you look at the notion of personhood throughout human history, we have a very, very variegated history here. For a long period of time, the only people accorded personhood were male rulers. Nobody else was a person. Everybody else was a vassal, and only the male rulers were afforded personhood. Then at some stage in our evolutionary trajectory, we decided that all adult freeborn males were persons, but nobody else. So if you were a freeborn male, an adult, now you became a person. Then in 1865, the US, allowed corporations to be persons, literally. So according to our law, corporations are persons. They have all the rights and privileges of persons, which has allowed them to interfere constantly in our electoral process. At some stage then finally, even adult females were accorded personhood. A later stage was even children were accorded, personhood. And finally, even slaves were recognized to be persons. So personhood is very, very different even from human life. So that's the third consideration: life, human life, and personhood, as we begin to wrestle with this question of abortion. In the 1840s in South Africa, when the big game hunters had to get their permits in order to go out hunting in the bush or in the Kalahari, they had to be given permits to kill particular kinds of life. And then they had to make a record of what they killed. And there's a list that still extant from that period of time, where under the title mammals, the hunters reported that they had killed 400 Kung females, 400 Bushman females. They were regarded as just a type of mammal, and they could be hunted and killed. And indeed, in that particular year, 400 Bushman females were killed and recorded because they had permits to do it. So they weren't persons back in the 1840s. In Tasmania, when the British invaded Tasmania, they regarded the native Maori as animals. And so they exterminated the Maori population of the time. And they took the last two survivors, a male and a female. They sent them to a taxidermist, I'm not joking you, to be stuffed and sent back to the British Museum. And these two beings were in the British Museum for over 100 years before they were recently repatriated back to Tasmania. So even though they weren't even regarded as humans, they may have been a life form, but not a human form, and certainly not accorded a personhood. So personhood is a kind of a moving target. So then the question I ask myself as I think of this issue is, before females and children and slaves were legally accorded personhood, were they not people? If they weren't persons, then strictly speaking, they weren't people, it seems, according to our kind of taxonomy. And what happens then when we rescind personhood? And this also has happened many times in human history. And the stages are always the same. As you want to rescind personhood to a group of people, the first thing you do is you dehumanize them. They are no longer human. Then you vilify them. Then you ostracize them. And finally, you exterminate them. They're always the four stages. You dehumanize them. They're not persons anymore. They're not even human beings anymore. And now you vilify them for some perceived aspect of theirs. Then you ostracize them in some way. And then finally, you exterminate them. And even in our own lifetime, we've seen this happen. In World War II, 6 million Jews were exterminated on the basis of being denied personhood and being regarded as vermin. The same thing had happened in the Armenian genocide during World War I, where 1.5 million Armenians were exterminated by the final vestiges of the empire of the time in Turkey, on the basis that they were no longer human beings. And in our own time, we've seen that in Rwanda in 1994, where 800,000 Tutsis were annihilated. They were called cockroaches by the Hutus. And in a 3-month period, 800,000 Tutsis were slaughtered. So the personhood has been rescinded. So who gets to decide then who is a person? Is the fetus only afforded personhood if the mother says so? And if the mother says it's not a person, then simply it's kind of excising a malignant growth in her womb. Is that where the abortion debate lies? Who gets to decide whether a life form is human and whether it's a person, and or simply just a growth, a tumor? And the final consideration for me then is, having looked at life, at human life, at personhood, is the notion of en-soulment. When does the soul enter the developing embryo or fetus? And again, for me, this is a deeply spiritual question. How do you know when a soul takes occupancy of a particular kind of spacesuit? Does it come in, as the modern Roman Catholic Church would have us believe, at conception, that at the very moment, that a man and a woman make love, a sperm meets an egg, and a zygote is created, God is watching with binoculars, and it says, okay, I'm going to create a brand new soul, get in there quick. And all of a sudden, you have an ensouled human being? Is that what we believe? As I said, Aquinas said it took 40 days for that to happen if it was going to be a boy, and 80 days if it was going to be a girl. But the greatest pity for me, as I think about this from a spiritual perspective, is, and next week, obviously, I'll talk about the morality of the decisions and the factors that influence the particular decisions. But for a final statement for me, I think that the greatest pity of abortion is that volunteer souls are now denied the possibility of incarnation. Namaste, my brothers and sisters.